10:42 at night. The press room at Chase Center was charged with the typical tension of an eliminatory playoff defeat. Steph Curry had just sat down in front of the microphones, still wearing his sweaty Warriors uniform, when Jake Morrison raised his hand with a predatory smile that would make any father in the world feel a chill down his spine. What happened in the next 90 seconds not only redefined the limits of American sports journalism, but became the most shared moment in the E2 history of basketball-related social media. To understand how 90 seconds of paternal courage redefined the limits of sports journalism, we need to go back to the question that crossed all lines, and to the answer that silenced not just a room, but an entire country. Steph Curry was visibly dejected. The Warriors had lost Game 6 of the Western Conference semifinals by just 3 points, eliminating them from the season in brutal fashion. 16 years of playoffs, 4 titles won, and yet each elimination hurt like the first. Have you ever seen someone trying to maintain professional composure when all they want is to go home and hug their family? Curry was living exactly that moment, automatically responding to routine questions about strategies, decisive plays, and plans for the next season. Family is not news, it's sacred, his wife Isha had said the night before, when they learned that some reporters were trying to involve personal matters in playoff coverage. If someone crosses that line, you have my support to defend our home. Curry didn't know that those words would become prophetic in less than 24 hours. Jake Morrison was in the third row, laptop open, digital recorder strategically positioned, and that look of someone who had found exactly the controversy he was looking for. At 43 years old, Morrison had built an entire career on top of controversial questions and sensationalist headlines. It was impossible not to notice the difference between Morrison and the other journalists in the room. While experienced reporters like Ashley Williams from ESPN maintained a respectful posture, even when asking difficult questions, Morrison radiated a predatory energy that made everyone around feel uncomfortable. "Steph, a question about performance," Morrison said, his voice cutting through the air with a false cordiality that fooled no one. Curry looked in his direction, and something imperceptible changed in his expression, a primordial instinct of alertness that every father develops. "Sure," Curry responded diplomatically, mentally preparing himself for another question about statistics or tactical decisions. What came next shocked not only Steph Curry, but every person in the room who had spent years covering professional sports. Many analysts have commented that your performances at home versus away show a significant difference, Morrison began, building his question with the patience of someone setting up an ambush. Some suggest that the domestic distractions might be affecting your focus during this playoff series. How is it possible for someone to transform family love into professional weakness? Morrison was doing exactly that, and every word that came out of his mouth revealed not just journalistic bad faith, but a complete lack of understanding about basic human values. Curry took a deep breath, immediately recognizing the trap. "My family is my greatest source of strength and motivation," he responded calmly. "I don't see how love and support could be distractions." But Morrison hadn't finished. On the contrary, he had just begun. "Well, specifically, some observers have noted that you seem more tense when Isha and the girls are visible in the stands," Morrison continued, his voice gaining a calculated cruelty. "Ryan and Riley are what age again? 8 and 6? It's a lot of pressure for such small children to be constantly under the spotlight of such an unstable career in the playoffs. What's most impressive is how some people can use their profession as a shield for personal cruelty. Morrison wasn't doing journalism. He was purposefully attacking what Steph Curry held most sacred. Ashley Williams, veteran journalist with 20 years of experience, exchanged shocked glances with other colleagues. Marcus Williams, Warriors press liaison, leaned forward, clearly prepared to intervene if necessary. Curry felt something burn in his chest. Not uncontrolled anger, but the type of cold and calculated fury that every father feels when someone threatens their children. His hands closed imperceptibly over the microphone. "Jake," Curry said, his voice maintaining impressive control despite the storm forming behind his eyes. "I'm not sure where you want to go with this line of questioning." "Oh, I think I've been quite clear." Morrison smiled with the satisfaction of someone who knew he had hit a sensitive nerve. "I'm asking if Steph Curry can separate being a Kobe father from being a professional, or if family responsibilities are compromising his ability to lead this team when it matters most. Naturally, this leads us to the moment when Jake Morrison made the most devastating mistake of his journalistic career: confusing professional silence with personal weakness. The silence that followed in the room was the type of silence that precedes earthquakes. Christopher Lee, experienced cameraman who had covered hundreds of press conferences, instinctively adjusted his camera's focus, sensing he was about to capture something historic. Curry stared at Morrison for a moment that seemed to last an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but loaded with an authority that made the entire room pay attention. "Jake, do you have children?" The question caught Morrison off guard. That's not relevant to... Do you have children, yes or no?" "No, I don't. But I don't see how..." "Then let me explain something to you." Curry leaned, slightly forward, and even sitting, his presence filled the entire room. "My daughters are children. They didn't choose this public life. They didn't ask to be under spotlights. They're just two little girls who love their father and want to support him. How many times do we witness someone transform a personal attack into a lesson about basic humanity? Curry was offering a masterclass in how to maintain dignity under fire. "And if you think," Curry continued, his voice gaining a firmness that made Morrison involuntarily recoil, "that I'm going to sit here listening to you use my little daughters as ammunition for your sensationalist headlines, you've miscalculated very badly who you're messing with." The energy in the room completely changed. Other reporters stopped typing. Cameras turned toward Morrison, who suddenly realized he had become the villain of the very story he was trying to create. Morrison tried to recover. "Steph, I was just asking a legitimate question about..." "There was nothing legitimate about that question," Curry interrupted him, his voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade. "You attacked my wife. You attacked my daughters. You transformed family love into professional weakness. This isn't journalism, Jake. This is cruelty." It was possible to feel the tension growing like static electricity before a storm. Morrison had clearly underestimated not only Curry's emotional intelligence, but also his moral courage when it came to protecting family. Ashley Williams was mentally rewriting her own story. She had come to cover a playoff elimination, but was witnessing something much more significant: a defining moment about limits, decency, and what really matters. Diana Thompson, San Francisco Chronicle editor who was watching remotely via live stream, was already on the phone with her editor-in-chief. "We need to change our main headline," she whispered. "Something much bigger is happening here." Morrison, realizing he had completely lost control of the situation, did what any desperate person would do: doubled down. "Steph, with all due respect, You're a public figure. Your family chose this exposure, and fans have the right to know if personal issues are affecting. Curry stood up. Not abruptly. Not with uncontrolled anger, but with the slow and menacing deliberation of someone who had made an irrevocable decision. The entire room fell into absolute silence. The only audible sound was the low hum of cameras recording. What everyone knew would become a historic moment. "Jake," Curry said, now standing, looking directly at Morrison, "you just made the biggest mistake of your career." And at that moment, Jake Morrison realized he had awakened something in Steph Curry that he wasn't prepared to face. But what happened next would change everything forever. Steph Curry remained standing for exactly 8 seconds. 8 seconds that seemed like an eternity for Jake Morrison, who suddenly realized he had awakened. Something much more powerful than the anger of a frustrated athlete. He had awakened the protective fury of a father. "Please sit down." Morrison tried to regain control of the situation, his voice carrying a false authority that only fooled himself. "We're just having a professional discussion here. Have you ever seen someone try to control a situation they had already completely lost?" Morrison was offering a perfect demonstration of how arrogance can blind someone to their own imminent downfall. Curry didn't sit down. Instead, he walked slowly around the press conference table, each step deliberate, until he was facing Morrison. The height difference, Curry with his 6 feet 3 inches versus seated Morrison, created a visual dynamic that made it clear to the entire room who really commanded that moment. "Jake," Curry said, his voice low but audible to every person in the room, "you said you were asking a professional question. Let me ask you a professional question. How long have you worked as a journalist?" Morrison hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the role reversal. 15 years, but I don't see how that's relevant." 15 years, Curry repeated, as if processing very important information. "And in 15 years of career, how many times have you used small children as ammunition to attack an athlete professionally?" It was impossible not to notice that Curry had completely transformed the dynamics of the press conference. He was no longer answering questions. He was conducting a real-time moral judgment, broadcast live to millions of people. Ashley Williams, veteran journalist who had covered Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, and LeBron James in their most intense moments, had never witnessed anything like this. An athlete not only defending his family, but educating a colleague about basic professional ethics. "Steph, I think you're overreacting," Morrison tried to minimize, but his voice trembled slightly. "Questions about personal life are a normal part of sports coverage." "Normal part?" Curry interrupted him, and for the first time his voice carried genuine indignation. "Jake, tell me, what are the ages of your nieces?" What does that have to do with—" "Answer the question." "I don't have nieces," Morrison reluctantly admitted. "Sisters? Young cousins? Any child in your life that you love enough to protect?" How is it possible for someone to reveal so clearly their own emotional emptiness in a simple question? Morrison was discovering that there are questions that expose much more about who asks than about who answers. "That's not relevant to the discussion," Morrison insisted. But now other reporters in the room were exchanging significant glances. It was becoming clear to everyone that Morrison had crossed a line that even he didn't know existed. Curry crouched slightly, getting to Morrison's eye level. "Jake, it's very relevant, because if you had any child in your life that you loved, you would understand that there are sacred limits that decent people don't cross. Naturally, this leads us to the moment when Steph Curry decided to educate not only Jake Morrison, but the entire sports journalism industry about where the limits of professional coverage should be. You want to talk about pressure? Curry continued, his voice gaining an intensity that made the entire room lean forward. I'll tell you about real pressure, Jake. Real pressure is explaining to a 6-year-old girl why strangers write cruel things about daddy on the internet. Marcus Williams, Warriors press liaison, was torn between intervening to protect his athlete and letting Curry finish what clearly needed to be said. Real pressure, Curry continued, is an 8-year-old girl asking if she should stop going to daddy's games because some journalists think her presence is a distraction. Real pressure is trying to keep a family united and healthy when people like you transform love into weakness for your cheap headlines. What's most impressive is how truth expressed with genuine passion can completely transform the energy of an environment. Curry wasn't just defending his family. He was articulating something that millions of parents around the world felt but could never express. Christopher Lee, experienced cameraman, realized he was documenting something historic. Not just a press conference, but a defining moment about values, limits, and what really matters in life. Morrison tried one last time to regain control. Steph, you're being very emotional about this. Sports journalism has always included aspects of athletes' personal lives. Emotional? Curry straightened completely, and his height now seemed even more imposing. Jake, let me explain the difference between journalism and what you did here today. Curry began walking slowly around the room, but maintaining eye contact with Morrison. Journalism would be asking how I balance career and family. Journalism would be exploring how athletes deal with public pressure. What you did was use 2 small children, who never did you any harm, as weapons to try to hurt me emotionally and create a sensationalist headline. It was possible to feel that every word from Curry was being absorbed not only by Morrison, but by every journalist in the room. A real-time lesson about the difference between legitimate curiosity and cruelty disguised as professionalism. Ashley Williams was transcribing every word, knowing she was witnessing something that would be quoted in journalism schools for decades. Diana Thompson, editor following via livestream, was mentally rewriting not just her headline, but her entire understanding of how sports coverage should work. Family is not news, it's sacred, Curry said, his key phrase now carrying all the weight of his personal conviction. And when you transform the sacred into entertainment, you stop being a journalist and become something much worse. What exactly? Morrison asked, in a desperate attempt to regain some control of the situation. Curry stopped walking and looked directly at him. You become a predator who feeds on family pain to gain views. The silence that followed was absolute. Morrison had lost not only control of the interview, but all credibility before his peers. Other journalists in the room were clearly on Curry's side, some nodding discreetly in approval. Morrison, realizing he was being completely demoralized publicly, made one last, desperate attempt. Steph, you're being unfair. I have the right to ask difficult questions. You have the right to ask questions, Curry agreed, but you don't have the right to use children as ammunition. You don't have the right to transform family love into professional weakness. And you definitely don't have the right to sit in my press conference and attack the 2 most precious people in my life. How many times do we witness someone defend fundamental principles with such eloquence that they transform critics into admirers? Curry was doing exactly that, earning the respect even of journalists who had initially come looking for controversial headlines. Jake, Curry said, his voice now carrying a finality that made Morrison realize the lesson was coming to an end. You have choices to make. You can continue being the type of journalist who attacks families to gain clicks, or you can decide you want to do real journalism. And if I choose to continue doing my job my way? Morrison asked, in one last demonstration of defiance. Curry smiled, not with malice, but with the tranquility of someone who knew exactly how to answer that question. Then you'll discover what happens when someone decides my family is an acceptable target, Curry said calmly. And I can guarantee, Jake, that it won't be a pleasant discovery. Morrison swallowed hard, finally understanding that he had underestimated not only Steph Curry's emotional intelligence, but also his determination to protect those he loves. The room was in total silence when Curry made his final statement of the press conference. Family is not news, it's sacred. And any person who can't understand that doesn't deserve a platform to question values they never comprehended. No one could imagine that moment would be the turning point. What happened in the next 40 seconds not only silenced Jake Morrison, but permanently redefined how professional athletes would approach family matters in the media. Steph Thede. Curry was about to deliver one of the most powerful and quoted statements in sports journalism history. Curry walked until he was directly in front of Morrison, not threateningly, but with the commanding presence of someone who had made an irrevocable decision. The silence in the room was so profound that the sound of recording cameras seemed like distant thunder. Jake, Curry began, his voice now carrying a moral authority that made every person in the room straighten involuntarily. You want to know what really motivates me? What makes me wake up at 5 in the morning to train? What makes me ignore criticism, injuries, and defeats like today's? Have you ever witnessed the moment when someone decides to stop defending themselves and start teaching a lesson that will change lives? Curry was transforming his personal pain into universal education, and every word that came out of his mouth carried the weight of years of experience as a father and public athlete. Morrison, visibly uncomfortable with Curry's physical and moral proximity, tried to stand up, but Curry made a gentle gesture with his hand that made him remain seated. It wasn't physical intimidation. It was pure, moral presence. I'm going to tell you, Curry continued, because maybe this will help you understand the difference between building and destroying through words. Ashley Williams had completely stopped typing. Christopher Lee adjusted his camera to capture every nuance of Curry's expression. Marcus, Williams' press liaison, realized he was witnessing something that transcended basketball or press conferences. It was a defining moment about fundamental human values. Every morning, Curry said, his voice gaining a softness that contrasted with the intensity of his presence. Before the sun even rises, I meditate for 15 minutes. And do you know what I think about during those 15 minutes? It was impossible not to feel that the entire room was being educated about something much bigger than sports. Curry was articulating a life philosophy that would resonate far beyond that moment. I think about the 2 little girls sleeping in the next room, dreaming about princesses, unicorns, and maybe, just maybe, about Daddy making a few more beautiful shots in the next game. Naturally, this leads us to the most powerful moment of Curry's statement, when he transformed paternal protection into a universal lesson about responsibility and purpose. Ryan and Riley don't know yet about media pressure, cruel criticism, or people like you who think they can use children as entertainment, Curry continued, each word falling like raindrops on thirsty soil. They only know that they love Daddy, and that Daddy loves them more than anything in the world. How is it possible for someone to transform personal vulnerability into inspiring moral strength? Curry was demonstrating exactly how to do that, using his paternal love as a platform to educate about basic decency. Morrison tried to interrupt. "Steph, I understand your position, but—" "No, Jake," Curry interrupted him with a gentle but unshakable firmness. "You don't understand. And that's why I'm explaining." Curry stepped back slightly, allowing his voice to reach the entire room. "Every victory I achieve is for them. Every title is for them. Every difficult moment I overcome is to show them that obstacles can be overcome with hard work and integrity." Diana Thompson, following via livestream, was mentally rewriting not just her article, but her entire understanding of what responsible coverage of public figures who are also parents means. "And when someone like you," Curry continued, looking directly at Morrison, "decides they can attack these two children to gain a few clicks, you're not just attacking my family. You're attacking everything I work for, everything I believe in, everything I consider sacred. What's most impressive is how moral clarity expressed with genuine passion can transform attackers into defenders." Other journalists in the room were clearly on Curry's side, some nodding in silent approval. Curry paused, letting his words penetrate. When he continued, his voice carried a determination that made Morrison involuntarily recoil in his chair. "Family is not news. It's sacred," he said, his key phrase now carrying all the power of a statement of principles. "And any person who transforms the sacred into cheap entertainment needs to understand that there are consequences for this type of cruelty." "What kind of consequences?" Morrison asked, his voice coming out weaker than intended. Curry smiled, not with malice, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where he stood morally. "Jake, you have the right to ask difficult questions about my performance, my decisions on the court, my team leadership. You even have the right to question my professionalism or dedication," Curry said calmly. "But the moment you decide to attack two little children, who never did you any harm, you stop being a journalist and become something I will protect my family against. How many times do we witness someone draw limits so clear and morally unquestionable that they transform critics into admirers?" Curry was offering a masterclass in how to defend principles without losing dignity. "And how exactly do you intend to protect your family?" Morrison tried to regain some authority, but his voice trembled slightly. "The same way any father would protect his children," Curry responded, approaching again. "With truth, with integrity, and reminding the entire world who the people who really matter in this life are." Curry turned to the rest of the press room, including all journalists, in his final statement. "You have an important job," he said, his voice now including all reporters present. "You inform fans, cover the game we love, ask questions that need to be asked. I respect that, and have always respected it." Ashley Williams felt tears forming in her eyes. In 20 years covering sports, she had never witnessed an athlete articulate so clearly the difference between legitimate journalism and cruel exploitation. "But when you cross the line between informing and attacking children," Curry continued, "you stop being part of the solution and become part of the problem." Curry walked back to where Morrison was sitting, now completely silenced and visibly uncomfortable. "Jake, I'm going to ask one final question, and I want you to think carefully before answering," Curry said, his voice carrying all the moral authority he had built during the last 10 minutes. "If you had a little daughter, and someone used her as ammunition to attack you publicly, how would you feel?" Morrison opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. For the first time since he had initiated his attack, he seemed to be actually processing the moral implications of his actions. "Exactly," Curry said softly, correctly interpreting Morrison's silence. "You would feel exactly what I'm feeling now." It was possible to perceive that something fundamental had changed in the room. Morrison had lost not only the debate, but all moral credibility before his professional peers. Curry addressed the entire room one last time. "Family is not news. It's sacred. And any person who can't respect this basic line of human decency doesn't deserve a platform to attack values they never understood." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the sounds of cameras seemed to have stopped. Morrison was completely defeated, not by intimidation or anger, but by a moral lesson so clear and powerful that any response would be inadequate. Curry looked one last time at Morrison, then at the rest of the room, and made his final statement. "This press conference is over. And Jake," he paused, looking directly at the defeated reporter, "next time you want to do real journalism, you know where to find me. But if you want to continue attacking families, I suggest you find another job." Curry walked toward the exit, but stopped at the door for one last statement that would echo for decades in sports journalism. "Always remember, we are fathers first, athletes second. And any person who reverses that order is in the wrong business." And that's when the truth finally came out. 18 minutes and 47 seconds. That was exactly the time the complete video of Steph Curry's response took to become the most shared content in Twitter history, surpassing engagement records that seemed impossible to break. When Curry arrived home that night, his statement had already been viewed by 52 million people. "Daddy, why is everyone talking about you on Mommy's phone?" Riley asked when Curry found her drawing at the kitchen table, completely oblivious to the fact that she had become an involuntary symbol of a revolution in sports journalism. To understand how 90 seconds of paternal courage permanently changed the rules of engagement between athletes and media, we need to follow the tsunami of consequences that swept not only Jake Morrison's career, but the entire American sports journalism industry. Have you ever seen how a single moral statement can create waves that spread far beyond their original source? Curry's defense of his family was about to inspire changes that no one had anticipated. Jake Morrison left the press conference knowing his career was over, but didn't fully comprehend the magnitude of what he had lost, until he got home and found 847 voicemails from his editor, Diana Thompson. "Jake, you need to call me immediately," was the tone of the first message. "The video is everywhere, and it's not good." The subsequent messages became progressively more urgent until the last one. "Jake, don't come to work tomorrow or next week. Actually, don't come. Ever again." Morrison had been fired from the San Francisco Chronicle before even leaving the Chase Center parking lot. It was impossible not to notice that the digital age had created a new reality for public figures. Questionable moral behavior now had immediate and global consequences. Morrison was discovering this in the most public way possible. Diana Thompson, who had followed the entire press conference via live stream, spent the next 3 hours on the phone with lawyers, editors-in-chief, and public relations specialists, trying to limit the damage to the newspaper's reputation. "In 25 years editing sports," she told the Chronicle's publisher, "I've never seen a journalist self-destruct so completely and publicly." Morrison didn't just attack a family. He did it in front of cameras that were broadcasting live to the entire world. How is it possible for someone to build a 15-year career and destroy it with a single malicious question? Morrison was learning that in the social media era, reputation can be devastated in real time. Ashley Williams, veteran journalist who had witnessed the entire confrontation, wrote an article that would become required reading in journalism schools. The day Steph Curry taught us the difference between informing and attacking. I witnessed something extraordinary today, she wrote. An athlete not only defending his family, but educating our entire profession about where the limits of sports coverage should be. Morrison crossed a line he didn't even know existed, and Curry didn't just redefine it, he made it unbreakable. Naturally, this leads us to the moment when Curry's response inspired a systemic change that transcended individual sports or isolated cases. In the 48 hours following the press conference, something extraordinary happened. Dozens of other professional athletes began sharing their own stories about predatory journalism and attacks on their families. LeBron James posted, "Steph Curry just said what all of us have been feeling for years. Family is not news. It's sacred. Thank you for having the courage to draw that line." Serena Williams wrote, "As a mother, every word from Steph touched me deeply. Our children deserve to grow up without being used as ammunition by cruel adults." The Sacrant Family is not news movement gained national traction, with millions of people sharing stories about how media attacks had affected their own families. What's most impressive is how a personal defense can transform into a social movement when it resonates with experiences shared by millions. Curry had articulated something that parents around the world felt but couldn't express. Marcus Williams, Warriors press liaison, was receiving calls from professional sports organizations wanting to implement new guidelines about coverage of athletes' families. Steph didn't just defend his family, Marcus explained to an NBA panel 3 days after the incident. He completely redefined the terms of engagement between professional athletes and media. Now we have to codify these guidelines to protect all families. 6 months. After the press conference, the NBA, NFL, MLB, and NHL jointly implemented the Curry Protocol, specific guidelines about appropriate questions related to athletes' families. Christopher Lee, the cameraman who had captured the entire confrontation, discovered that his video was being used in university journalism courses as an example of how a single malicious question can destroy not just a career, but the credibility of an entire industry. "I never imagined I would be filming a historic moment," Lee said in an interview with Columbia Journalism Review. "I thought I was just covering another post-game press conference." Meanwhile, Jake Morrison was learning about consequences very personally. No other media outlet hired him after his dismissal. His attempt to become an independent blogger failed when advertisers refused to support someone who had become a symbol of predatory journalism. How many times do we witness someone having to completely confront who they became to have a chance at redemption? Morrison was facing exactly that journey. 1 year after the incident, something unexpected happened. Morrison contacted Steph Curry through an intermediary, asking for a private conversation. "Steph," Morrison said when they finally met at a discreet cafe in San Francisco, "I know I don't deserve your time, but I want you to know something." Curry listened in silence, while Morrison continued, "You were right about everything. I had become exactly what you said. Someone who fed off family pain to gain views. I lost my job, my credibility, my self-respect, but more importantly, I understood what I did." It was possible to perceive that Morrison had undergone genuine transformation. Arrogance had been replaced by humility, cruelty by understanding. "Jake," Curry responded, "everyone deserves second chances when they demonstrate real growth." Morrison was now working as an instructor in a journalistic ethics course, using his own downfall as an example of what not to do. His first book, The Question That Changed My Life, Lessons About Ethics and Redemption, would become a bestseller and required reading for journalism students. 2 years after the press conference that changed everything, Steph Curry was honored by the Society of Professional Journalists with the Defender of Journalistic Ethics Award, the first time a professional athlete had received such recognition. In his acceptance speech, Curry said, "Family is not news, it's sacred. And when we protect what is sacred, we protect the values that make our society better." Ashley Williams, who had become one of the leading voices in sports journalism reform, was in the audience. "Steph Curry didn't just defend his family that day," she wrote afterward. "He defended the idea that there are limits that decent people don't cross, regardless of profession." Riley and Ryan Curry, now 10 and 8 years old, occasionally asked about Daddy's famous video. Curry always responded the same way. "Sometimes, when you love someone enough, you find courage you didn't even know you possessed." Diana Thompson, who had become an advocate for sports journalism reforms, frequently cited the Curry moment in lectures about professional ethics. "A man defending his family taught us more about responsible journalism than decades of corporate guidelines." 3 years after that transformative press conference, Jake Morrison published an open letter apologizing to the Curry family. The letter ended with, "Steph Curry taught me that family really is not news, it's sacred, and that some lessons can only be learned through consequences that forever changed who I am." Curry responded publicly, "Jake learned something we can all learn, that real growth begins when we honestly confront our own mistakes." Steph Curry had confronted a reporter who disrespected his family, and his response not only silenced everyone in the room, it inspired an entire generation of athletes, journalists, and parents to completely rethink where the limits should be between public life and family protection. "Family is not news, it's sacred," became more than a phrase. It became a principle that redefined how society balances public curiosity with basic human decency. And perhaps, just perhaps, that's the true definition of leadership: using moments of personal pain to teach lessons that make the world better for everyone.